Hi everyone, Ryan Adams with Microsoft, working in our Synapse Customer Success Engineering team. Today we're going to take a look at how can we disable public access to our workspace inside Synapse. And more importantly is, after we do that, how can we provide access to the systems that need to manage it, depending upon how our network's set up. And we'll take a look at two different methodologies to do that. So we'll take a look at my setup here. I have three resource groups we're going to focus on here. The first two here, PE Synapse or Private Endpoint Synapse, is my workspace. This is the resource group that comes with that. I have two client machines, Client 1 and Client 2. Both of them are in their own separate networks and their own VNETs. That we'll look at two different ways to provide access to those machines to my workspace. Let's take a look at the workspace first, and we're going to come down here and zoom in on the networking section. We'll click networking, and that's going to bring up this page here where we can disable public network access. Now, I've already disabled my public network access here. If you didn't do this when you set this up and you left it turned on, then the radio button will be enabled, and you will also have some firewall rules down here. Now, I don't have any because I've removed mine, or if you created it as disabled to begin with, you won't have any here. But if you do leave it on when you create the workspace, there will be an allow all rule here. If you want to, you can leave public on. Just because public is turned on does not mean that it is wide open to the internet. Although internet traffic may be allowed to access it, there is still a firewall sitting in front of the Synapse workspace. So don't think that it's just wide open. A lot of folks get that confused. There is a firewall here. We just need to edit that rule or delete the default rule and just add here by adding client IPs. You can add ranges of workspaces or whatever virtual VNets you have. We can add all of that right here to grant access to the workspace. Now, I've already done that, so let's go in and open up my first client. So this is client 1. I've got the portal open up here as well, and I'm going to click Open Synapse Studio. And we're going to let this open and see what happens. And what should happen is we get this failure message right here in the middle. It says we failed to load one or more resources due to forbidden issue with error code 403. This is exactly expected, right? We turned off public access. We said that we didn't want anything to come off the public internet or anywhere else for that matter. Even this VM that's in Azure, right? It's not on the internet, right? It's sitting in Azure in its own private VNet. We have said no access at all. So this message is actually by design. I would totally expect to get this message. Now you can click View Details here. And what View Details, it'll bring up another flyout over on the right hand side, and what it'll do is it'll expand the list because it says and 9 more, because there's 9 more other possible services that it could be. But really all we need to focus on is the fact that it says, hey, this is forbidden, and it's the 403 error. So we know that this is network related, right? That's not a Synapse error, right? That's an HTTP error code that's saying forbidden, that we don't have access to get into this. So this is definitely a networking thing right out of the gate, but sometimes this can be hard for folks to figure out. So I'm going to close this tab. That's really fully expected. Let's go back into the portal though. Because we turned off public access, in order to grant access to specific machines or networks, we have to create private endpoints. So we'll go into private endpoint connections here. I'm going to click the plus sign up here. We're going to add a private endpoint. And the private endpoint, we're going to target the VNet that virtual machine of mine is sitting in, client 1. So this says, where do you want to put the endpoint? I could put it in any resource group I want. I'm going to go ahead and leave it here in my Synapse Workspace group. I might want to put it in the client group. That's up to you where you want to put that at. I'm going to give this a name, Private Endpoint Dev Client 1. This allows me to know that it's targeted to Client 1, and we'll come back and talk about why I chose to put dev here in the middle for my naming convention. I'll cover that in just a second. It does also create a network interface to use for the private endpoint, and then of course the region. It is important that you make sure that this region is in the exact same region that your workspace is in. We'll click Next. We'll go into the Resource tab here. Select a subscription. It's already selected for us. For resource type, we'll scroll all the way down here to the bottom. And what we're focused on here is we have two options for Synapse. We have one for private link hubs, and we have one for workspaces. The one that we want to work with today is going to be workspaces. So we'll go ahead and select that because we're targeting the workspaces. And then that will, when I do this resource here, it says, well, which workspace do you want? It shows me all the workspaces in my subscription. PE Synapse is the one workspace that we're targeting. And then there's this sub-resource. There's 3 of them here. This one is to create a private endpoint that will access any of the dedicated pools inside my workspace. SQL On Demand will allow access to any of the serverless pools in my workspace. Dev is what enables access to our web front end, our client, as we go in and launch the workspace in the web browser. It also handles things like when you create notebooks and SQL scripts inside your workspace and you send those to the compute services. That is also all part of the dev. Today, we're just going to focus on dev and getting the portal to work. The process would be exactly the same for the others. So if you've got a dedicated endpoint, you've got serverless that you're planning on using, you would come back and add both of those. So you would want to do all 3. Again, we'll just do dev today, but the process is exactly the same. You just come back in and select one of the other 2. So you would have to repeat this process 3 times. So it says, hey, what VNet do you want to put this endpoint in? Well, I want it to go to my client 1. So I'm going to put it in my client 1 VNet. I'm going to select here. That's where the private endpoint will go. I only have one subnet, which is the default. Dynamic allocation of IPs is perfectly fine for me here. And the next one is DNS. So because we're creating a private endpoint with a non-internet routable IP range, we are going to need to take a look at DNS. In order to be able to resolve that, we're going to need a private DNS zone, and this will allow us to create that automatically. Now, if you have other zones that you've already got configured, or you're handling DNS in other ways, you could select no here and just go create an A record inside of that DNS zone wherever you're hosting that at. If not, we just create a private DNS zone here. It automatically selects my subscription. You put it in whatever resource group. I'll keep it in the client resource group. Perfectly fine for me here. I'm not going to do any tags. Obviously, if you are in a production environment, you'd want to put some tags in here for your resources. And then I'm going to go ahead and click Create here. And that's going to go out and create our resources. It's going to create the private endpoint itself, right? There's a NIC card that goes with that. There's a private DNS zone that it's obviously going to create as well that we told it to do in order to get access into this workspace. Now, why that's creating itself, I want to show you this diagram here. This is a pretty standard way of looking at how we would do networking in a cloud scenario. And this is a hub and spoke setup. And my hub VNet is sitting here in the center, and that is basically where I'm putting client 1 at right now. What we're going to want to come back and take a look at, though, is what about the spokes? We need to figure out, since I have some VMs sitting inside of a spoke, how does it get access? Because the private endpoints are sitting here, right? And what happens is if we've disabled public access to my workspace, which sits over here, then the only thing that I can connect to with that are going to be those 3 private endpoints that I used for their respective services here, which means anything inside this hub VNet should be able to resolve and access these private endpoints. But what if I have machines that are sitting out in my spokes here and here. How do I get them access to be able to get to my workspace? There's two different methods. We'll take a look at both of those methods here in just a second in order to figure out how we can grant access to those spokes. So we'll go ahead and pause here. We'll come right back as soon as this is done creating all of my resource groups, and we'll pick up right where we left off at. So now that we're back, everything has been completed. Let's go take a quick look at the actual resources themselves just to see where those are. So let's take a look at our Synapse resource group here first. And these were already here because this is my Synapse Workspace. This is my storage account. But these are the two new things that I added, right? So the private endpoint happens to be our first item here. And then here's the NIC card that responds to that private endpoint. So those are sitting here. If I look at the client where this VM sits, and we didn't look at this before, but nothing has changed here. It just added the private DNS zone, which I can see down here at the bottom. That way, anything inside this VNet is going to be able to resolve the private endpoints that I've created. So in theory, we should be able to access this now, right? So let's jump back into our virtual machine. Here's the client 1 virtual machine. As we take a look here, we're going to open Synapse Studio, and ideally we should be able to get in. Right, we've created the private endpoint. We've created the DNS zone, and sure enough, as soon as I come in here, there's no error message anymore. I'm able to see everything. Now, one other thing that I have seen folks run into is they forgot to create all 3 of those private endpoints. So if I came down to manage and I'm looking at my SQL pools, you might come in and find your serverless pool. Right, this is built in, it's my serverless pool, and you might see this, unavailable. Right? The reason this is unavailable is because I haven't created a private endpoint to be able to access the serverless pool. Right, so I would need to go back through the process we just did, and I would select SQL on demand as opposed to dev, which is what we just did, and create that. The same would also be true if I had a dedicated pool. I don't have one in this example, in this workspace, but it would look exactly the same. So we would need to be able to do that. So this is great. We disabled public access. We're using private endpoints. I've created them inside of my hub network, which is where my client 1 sits. So I'm able to access everything perfectly fine. But what about the other one? I had a second client machine, which is this one right here. And this machine, if I launch, I'm going to get the error message back again. But remember, this error message is exactly what I would have expected to get. It's what we got before. And why? It's in a different network, a different VNet. It's sitting here in the spoke. Client 1 was sitting inside my hub. It has no problem accessing all the endpoints here in the hub. It worked perfectly fine, just like I expected. But I need to figure out how I can make this work. And there's 2 answers to doing that. The first one is we can use peering. If I peer this VNet and this VNet, then anything inside the spoke will be able to go through the peer and access anything inside this hub VNet. So how do we do that? Well, let's take a look here. Now I can go to either VNet that I want to go to, but I'm going to focus on client 2 right here. And I can peer that into client 1. Now I could have gone to client 1 and done it from there. It doesn't really matter, because as we click, and I'll click on the VNet here, and I'm going to go down to peerings is the option we're looking for right here. So once we have clicked on peering, we can come in here and we'll click add up at the top to add a new peering between these two VNets. So we'll click Add here, and we're going to give this a name, and I'm in Client 2's VNet now, so I'm just going to call this Client 2 to Client 1, since that's the direction I'm headed here. And let me just type this in first here, Client 1 to Client 2, the other direction, and we'll zoom in and take a closer look. So I gave it a name here. I'm in Client 2, so this peer is going to be from Client 2 to Client 1, hence my naming. We're going to allow traffic to the remote virtual network, traffic forwarded from the remote virtual network. We're not using any network gateways or route servers here. And then down here, it says remote virtual network. Whenever you create a peer, and this is why I mentioned we could do it on one side or the other, it didn't matter, it creates both sides. So it doesn't matter where we start at. So this is actually saying, what do you want to name the peer on the other side in Client 1? Well, we'll call it the opposite, Client 1 to Client 2. Rest of the options here, we're going to pick Resource Manager. No need to use Classic anymore. Our subscription, and then we're going to use the drop-down box here, take a look at our VNet that we want to put this in. All right, so I'm in Client 2 right now, so the VNet that I'm targeting is going to be to create a peer over to Client 1's VNet. So I'll choose that option here. Rest of the choices here for remote virtual network, these are the same choices here for this side of the network as they were for the top side. We'll leave them all default. No need to change any of that, and we'll go ahead and click Add. So it's added the peer here, and it appears to be successful, right? Simply because it says, hey, you know, we've added the virtual network peering. I can see both of them right here. It's not really done yet. It's added the peer, but it really hasn't instantiated it yet. And you can see that here with the peering status. The status tells me that it's updating. So it's not actually fully complete just yet. I'll hit refresh here, and it might take a minute or two in order to fully go through. We could also look at it on the other side. So I'm looking at Client 2 right now. Let's go take a look at Client 1 as well in order to see what that looks like over there. So here's the VNet for Client 1. I'll go in and take a look at peerings here. And remember, this through the wizard was all created through the same thing, right? Client 1 to Client 2 on this side is what we called it. This is the name of the peer that we gave it. It's still in an updating status. So while it's still in updating, there's not really anything we can do. We'll have to wait for that to finish and complete. And sure enough, it looks like it already finished, right? So now I see connected here. So it should be ready to go now. Let's go double check the other side though real quick. Let's go take a look at Client 2. Go in and grab that VNet real quick, look at the peerings, and what I see now is it says it's updating. So we're not quite there on this side yet, but we are on the other. Looks like we just needed to refresh. As soon as I refresh, sure enough, now we're connected. So we should be fine. So now that we've done this, if I go to Client 2, which is in my spoke, I should now be able to click this, open up the Studio, and because I've created a peer from Client 2, which is the spoke, to Client 1, which is the hub, where the private endpoint is connected, it should work. But you'll notice that we get the same error message yet again. Exact same error. It's still not working. And there's a reason for this. There's something important that we forgot. And this is the part that a lot of people miss. Although we've created the peering, Client 2 that's out in the spoke has no way to resolve the IP address of that private endpoint. Remember, it's in a different VNet. So it can't talk to, if I go over here to Client 1, which is where my private DNS zone sits, the private DNS zone is sitting here with Client 1. It can't talk to that. So we have two ways to handle it. I could create another private DNS zone for Client 2, or the easier way, and this reduces some complication and duplication, is if I go into this private DNS zone, which is Client 1 inside of my hub network, if I go to virtual network links over here on the left, what I can do is I can create a new link to that virtual network. There's already one here by default, And if we look, the virtual network that it's connected to is client 1's VNet. So what we really need to do is create one that's going to talk to client 2's VNet. So let's go take a look at that. So we'll just call this client 2 VNet. And I'm going to choose client 2 VNet in my virtual network down here. So all I do is hit the drop-down box, select the client 2's VNet here, not a problem, and click OK. And this will go out and create that link, and that's going to allow anything inside of my spoke VNet 2 to now be able to talk and resolve things that are hosted inside of this private DNS zone, which has registrations for all of my private endpoints that I have created. Once this is completed, what we should be able to do is go back in. We're going to take a look at the client. It looks like it did finish here. So if I go back in, take a look at the client, which is client 2, and now we try to launch Synapse Studio, we should have a little bit more success here. Sometimes I may have been a little too fast, but it looks like it went through pretty quick. No error message, right? Everything is perfectly fine. So now we've seen how we can have machines that are sitting out here inside of spoke networks, if I'm in a hub and spoke configuration, that I can peer them into the hub where all of my private endpoints exist. And through that peer, we can make sure that we can get access to those private endpoints so long as we take this private DNS zone and also link it to the VNet. Now you have to do that link for every spoke that you have in order to make that be able to resolve for each individual spoke. And that is a frequently missed step. You could create more private DNS zones in each one of those VNets if you wanted to. However, that's really just kind of a duplication of efforts, really not necessary to do here. Now there is one other methodology that we have that we could do here, because not everybody uses a hub and spoke network. So what if I'm not doing that? What if I just had 3 separate VNets, completely independent? There is no peering here at all whatsoever, right? So there's no link between the VNets. There's no link between the VNets and the actual workspace itself. Over here on the right, what we could do if we didn't want to do peering, for whatever regulatory reasons we may have for company requirements, is we could do it individually. The only drawback to doing it individually that you'll notice is I have to create all 3 of those endpoints, right? My dev, my serverless pool, my dedicated pool. I'll have to create all 3 of them 3 times for every single, and 3 of my example, because I have 3 VNets here, right? However many VNets you have and networks you have, you would have to go create all 3 private endpoints in each one of them. So you can do it this way. This works perfectly fine, works exactly the same way as the others. The only difference here is the DNS zone. When I do a DNS zone like this, I'm duplicating across every one of my VNets the actual DNS zone itself, as opposed to creating links for all of them. You can't do a link here because you don't have a peer. So you have no choice but to be able to duplicate these. You'll have to do that. But this is another option that you have if you're not in a hub and spoke or in a situation where peering, for whatever your scenario is not okay, where you can't peer other VNets to the VNet that hosts those private endpoints for your Synapse workspace. Process is exactly the same to go in and create those endpoints. It just means I would go in and create them for another VNet. All right, so for VNet 2, and you'll notice, like, if I went back in and we take a look at, let's go take a look at our workspace here again. I'm going to open up the workspace. We're going to go take a look at private endpoint connections. What I can do here is just create another private endpoint. I'm going to call this private endpoint for dev client 2, right? Because now we're saying, what if I didn't have that peer set up? Then how would I handle this? So I've called this, using the dev, right? We're concerned about dev here. And I'm going to call this client 2. I'm going to create another endpoint that sits over in client 2. Okay, the resource group again, just like we did last time, we're going to come down here. We're going to take a look at Synapse. We're going to pick the Synapse Workspaces. That way we're just filtering the list down. Pick the workspace that we're targeting, which is my PE, Private Endpoint Synapse Workspace we're playing with here. We're going to stick with dev, right? So remember, we still have SQL and SQL on demand for the dedicated and serverless pools. We're just going to focus on dev now, but you would have to go create all 3 of those if you're using those services. And it says, which VNet do you want to attach this to? Well, I'm going to choose to attach this to the VNet for client 2. Dynamically allocate, just like we did last time. We get into DNS. We say, yes, go ahead and create a private DNS zone. Not worried about tags here, but you would be in a production environment, of course. And then I can go ahead and hit create. And this will go in and create the exact same resources that we did before. But a lot of people don't realize that you can duplicate this. A lot of folks think that, hey, once I've gone in and I've created a private endpoint to a VNet, I can only do that one time. I can't be duplicative, but you can. So which is exactly what we're doing here. It's going to go in and create these resources. We've already created them for client 1 and its VNet. Now we're letting it go in and create client 2 for the client 2 VNet. And this would mean that we wouldn't need the peer anymore. The peer could go away. We wouldn't need the link inside of our other private DNS zone because now we're creating a DNS zone inside of here. Just like we kind of saw in our diagram here, we're kind of duplicating everything, right? We had already, in our first walkthrough before we created the peer, we had already created all of this. Right? We created the dev endpoint in the private DNS zone. But because all of these other spokes were already attached here, we didn't have to have DNS zones for all of these. We were able to just kind of connect them and use that through the peer. But we do have to kind of duplicate them here. So this is another option that we have available. So it says the deployment is totally complete. We can certainly go back and take a look at what that looks like. In the first place, we're going to look at is, let's go look in the workspace for the resource group for our workspace first. And you'll notice that, yep, these are the ones we had before. This is client 1, its NIC, and its private endpoint. But now we have, we've got this created for client 2 as well. It has its private endpoint and its NIC. And if we go look at client 2, let's look at that resource group, we should see our private DNS zone sitting in here for that. Actually, just in this case, I just reused it. So now we have seen 2 different methodologies for how we can do this, whether we're using a hub and spoke network, which would look again like this, and we have to create the peer, and we've got to create the connection inside of our private DNS zone. Or if we are not able to do that and we just have multiple subnets, we can actually duplicate the effort of creating those private endpoints, all 3 of them, across every single particular network or VNet from where we would want to manage Synapse Analytics. So hopefully this has been helpful for everyone. If you are just catching the video out on YouTube, make sure you look down in the comments section. There'll be a link to the full blog post where all these diagrams and everything will all be documented out there for you in a written format. So if you're not watching this through the blog post and you're directly on YouTube, make sure you go look down in the comments and check out the blog post as well. And make sure you bookmark that for the future. And thanks for listening and hope this is helpful.